Japan, a country that you may or may not have heard about one way or another. Anime and its massive influence, the Shinkansen bullet trains that roar across the nation, the cities that dominate vast portions of the country, and the culture that has been existing for more than 2,000 years.
But there is something else about Japan that has great and special interest for some: their railways. What specific part of their railways, you may ask? I'm talking about the motive power that moves trains across the nation, the locomotives. From the old coal and water-powered steamers of the 19th and 20th centuries to the diesels and electrics that dominate the rails today.
What are these locomotives? What makes them unique and appealing to rail fans in Japan and overseas? With the help of this new series and its episodes, we will be going over not only these unique engines, but also the ways to spot, differentiate, and identify each of these locomotives. I'm Kanawa, not Berkshire.
I'm Hedwig5972.
And welcome to our YouTube series, Locomotives of Japan. In order to understand the origins of Japan's steam locomotives, we need to turn the clock back to October 14th, 1872. This was the day that Japan's very first railway opened, ushering in a new era for the nation. The first locomotive to run in Japan was number 1, who would go on to be labeled as the pioneer of all Japanese steam locomotives following her. Number 1 was built by the Vulcan foundry in Great Britain, as during this time, Japan has yet to start building its own locomotives domestically. If we compare number 1 along with the Class 860 and C62, we can see just how far the Japanese have come with their steam locomotive designs, all within the span of 78 years. From 1871 onwards to 1893, locomotives were built and delivered to Japan by foreign countries such as the United States of America, Great Britain, and Germany. It is important to note that locomotive builders such as the American Locomotive Company, Baldwin Locomotive Works, Rogers, and the Vulcan Foundry were among the many companies that built locomotives for Japan over those years. They ran for the Japanese government railways until they were retired by the 1930s, making way for more faster and reliable locomotives of the future Japanese National Railways, and those would be retired by 1975, marking the official end of steam on the Japanese railways. They ran on the 4 main islands that make up the Japan we know and recognize: Hokkaido, Honshu, Shikoku, and Kyushu. It is important to note that steam locomotives had different configurations depending on the region they ran in, from enclosed cabs in the cold north to shortened deflectors in the subtropical south. And that brings us to our next chapter, identification. We will start from the minor details and work our way up as we go. For identification via numbers and class types, they first started with the locomotive number made out of gold and oval number plates from 1872 to 1909. 1909 is when the number plate began being used, this time shaped as a rectangle rather than the oval that's been used prior to 1909, first having the number at the top and the classification type at the bottom. It would continue to be used past 1926 and 1928, but overall the classification below was generally phased out with newer plates that didn't have the classification below, given that the 1928 numbering system was already in place, and by that time the letters were already being used and therefore made things much easier to identify each locomotive in its class. Next up is the era or period the locomotive was built in. To put it simply, anything built between 1868 and 1912 is a Meiji period locomotive. The same thing can be said for Taisho period locomotives from 1912 to 1926, and Showa period locomotives from 1926 to 1989. This can also be applied to diesel and electric motive power built in the Heisei and Reiwa periods, 1989 to 2019, and 2019 to present day. Now that we went over the first two, we move on to the next few things that I'll try to simplify. And man, as a wise man once said,
"This is where the fun begins."
We'll start this off with a noticeable detail that is sometimes unique to Japanese steam locomotives: the smoke deflectors. The deflector began as an experiment in the 1920s, in addition to extended smoke boxes and angled smokestacks. And soon enough, all locomotives starting from the C-54 began using smoke deflectors regularly. Tank engines, on the other hand, varied, with some using deflectors at high speeds or in tunnels, or other tank engines that were deemed necessary to have them on. The normal smoke deflector is pretty much the same across many tender and tank engine classes, though varying in the shape to the respective class in question. Shortened, or Hokkaido deflectors as I'd like to call them, were used in Hokkaido where there was heavy amounts of snow. They were shorter than the standard deflectors to prevent snow from clogging up the pilot section of the running board. Ogura workshops in Kyushu, on the other hand, introduced deflectors that only had the lower portion cut off. These would go on to be called Moji or Montetsu, derived from the Moji Railway Management Bureau. A similar type was introduced by the Kagoshima and Goto workshops, as seen in the photos of D51-498 and C58-363. Already, we can see the similarities between the Moji and Goto deflectors, though they're not exactly alike, but once again, they're pretty similar. Next up is the cabs. The open cabs have been around since the very start, to put it simply, but enclosed cabs, on the other hand, had a different story. They were only used by locomotives that ran in Hokkaido, providing more warmth to the driver and fireman, but this is where it gets a bit confusing. Many engines in Hokkaido had open cabs, and others had enclosed cabs despite not running in the cold north. This would later be corrected by giving them the right specifications later on. Enclosed cabs then began being used regularly by all steam locomotives after the C-57, specifically the forced type or batch. The JGR and JNR used two whistles for their engines. Smaller engines used flat-top 3 chimes, and larger locomotives used 3 chimes. Eventually, all steam locomotives, tank and tender engines from 1928 onwards, used 5 chimes regularly. Here are 2 examples of the 3 and 5 chimes. The couplers. The Japanese used what is called screw couplers and had buffers until 1925. 1925 is when buffers and screw couplers would be removed in favor of the new at the time Jenny couplers, which were much stronger than the screws that were no longer useful. Next is the blocky-like lid that can be seen on top of the smoke box of most steam locomotives, the smoke collector. The smoke blasting out of the smokestack would often cause soot and ashes to accumulate on the ceiling of the tunnels, especially the long ones. This is where the smoke collector comes in. It works by guiding and changing the flow of the smoke when the locomotive is running through a tunnel. It was common to see D51s and C57s using the collector. And finally, the short terms. You may have noticed the term SL being used in forms of media featuring Japanese steam locomotives. The SL term comes from the first letters of the word steam locomotives, S for steam and L for locomotives, thus the term SL. 2 similar terms also surface for diesel and electric locomotives, DL and EL. They're pretty much the same terms as SL, but just for different types of locomotives. The story of Japanese diesel began with the class DB10, Japan's first domestically produced diesel locomotive. It was manufactured by Kawasaki Rolling Stock Company and Nippon Sharyo in 1932, with a total of 8 units serving as shunters. Since the DB10, newer and bigger designs were being drawn up over the years, and soon enough they would fully replace steam locomotives by 1975. One of these DLs was the class DD51, built by Hitachi, Kawasaki, and Mitsubishi from 1962 to 1978 to replace the D51s and C62s that were on the main line at the time. They are still in service to this day with the Japan Railways Group and JR Freight, along with a number of other diesels with both third sector railways and JR. The first Japanese electric, on the other hand, was the German-influenced Class EC40, built in 1919 by the Omiya factory to run on the Shin-Etsu line in eastern Japan. Electric locomotives in Japan were based on older designs that were imported from overseas. As the EL evolved over the years, so did the designs. Notable classes include the EF-10, EF-55, EF-66, and a whole other plethora of classes that I won't really mention to save some time. A variety of electrics are still in service to this very day with JR, notably the EF-66 with JR Freight. Whether you are a fan of steam, diesels, or electrics, there is always something from the railways of Japan in store, both old and new. Japanese railways have come a long way since the opening of the first railway in 1872. Since then, they have gone through many events time and time again. Yet they still stand and operate to this very day, loved by rail fans young and old alike who are willing to keep the railways alive and running no matter what. Whether you are from Japan or overseas, there is one thing we can all agree on: our love for Japanese railways. And that's the introductory episode of Locomotives of Japan. I sincerely apologize if I left out any important information in the video, as this was my first try at something like this on a massive scale. Not everything has a shiny and perfect start, and clearly Locomotives of Japan is one of those examples, but it will slowly start to evolve as time passes. Most importantly, and notably, episodes that will now be made at our own pace. I would greatly appreciate it if anyone with more information can post them in the comments section, as that will help with new viewers that are interested. Until then, I'm Kanawa, not Berkshire, and I'll see you in the next one.